What are the lessons that are being learned from these events?
Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
I was going to be pretty dismissive of the need for an East Wing ballroom whatsoever, but of course, there was a gunman that disrupted the correspondence dinner on April 25th. What was your experience of this as a media event? Because mine was, I was doing something on my computer, and I was like, oh, there's Trump at the podium. What was he giving a press conference for? And he's in a suit. Oh. And then he was like, oh, there was a gunman, and it doesn't look like anybody died. Okay. That was my experience, and it's peculiar how, oh, this was a violent act, but I would just another day. What was your experience of it?
Oh, I was just watching the news, as I do. I was actually looking for a live stream of the correspondence dinner. I wanted to see it on, I think it was C-SPAN or it was something on YouTube. It was either C-SPAN or it was one of them, and I was trying to find the live stream and I couldn't because what was happening was that the essentially they'd stop the live stream and there was all this reporting on what was going on, and so then I was like, what's going on? So I went to Reddit and checked the the news and the politics, and I also went to CNN. So I listened to Wolf Blitzer talking about his shoe and being in the bathroom and all that, where he had to be held in the bathroom for a while for security reasons. But I was trying to piece together what had actually happened and the severity of it. And the severity of it, it seems, wasn't like nothing actually happened other than them apprehending him.
A cop got shot, but he had a bulletproof vest, and he didn't want to go to the hospital, but he went anyway.
He survived, right? So to the extent of what actually happened, what was it that happened? I was trying to piece together the various things. So I read the posts, I read the social media, I checked NPR. I went to my default places that I look for news. NPR is a big one I read for news, breaking news, just because they generally are on top of like reporting news in a fair and effective manner, in my opinion. And also, they're one of the only institutions that have a public editor. So they have somebody at NPR who quite seriously just interfaces with the community and says, this is why we did what we did and how we arrived at the decisions to do what we did, the news that we're presenting and how we're sourcing things. And I think that's great, that they make a real effort to actually communicate what it is they're doing and why.
That's good.
And other media organizations aren't always so upfront about the way they're reporting things or the way that they're framing stories in particular. But no, so that was my reaction. And my thoughts then was, my immediate thought was, is this something related to the Iran war, right? Is this some kind of retaliation for what happened during the starting days of the Iran war? Is this an attack on U.S. soil similar to other attacks that have happened? In particular, my mind went to that synagogue that a guy drove into with his truck, where he blamed the war in Iran for driving his truck into a building. That was my immediate thought, is this something like that? Is this an ending of the ceasefire, or is the United States being attacked? As the story unfolded, clearly it's not, right? It's something else. It's essentially, it was an attempt to cause harm from a domestic assailant, which is bad too. Certainly it's bad, but it's not, the implications of it aren't as great as if it was the U.S. being directly attacked by Iran. Because Iran, it fights asymmetrically, right? So they fight with tools that are unpredictable and all that. And so that, at least in that regard, I was like, is this World War III, or is this essentially a guy's going to get arrested and thrown in prison for the rest of his life? And it's a guy's going to get arrested and thrown in prison for the rest of his life. That's what it is. It's bad. It's terrible, right? It sucks that it happens. But in terms of the grand scheme of history, what actually happened? A guy tried to get into an event and failed.
7 seconds of a security breach.
Yeah.
So the system held, right? The law enforcement did their job. And at least in that respect, that That's a silver lining to the whole, like, law enforcement did their job. No one got
Yeah,
severely
nice
hurt
work.
or wounded. Okay. I will say my other immediate thought, actually, if you really want to know, was I thought
Yeah.
about the Las Vegas shooter at the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in Las
Hmm.
Vegas. They had him on video going back and forth with these huge containers and luggage that it turns out was filled with guns and ammo. And it made me ask a very simple question. How was this guy able to get a room at a huge hotel and bring in a bunch of knives and guns? Last I checked, DC actually has strict gun control. It's not,
Uh-huh.
you can't just walk around with knives and guns in Washington, DC, right? Like, I understand the Second Amendment or whatever, but there are still, even in this day and age, actual restrictions on how you can bring those weapons around, if you can have those weapons on your person, if you can bring them into public places. And so my question there is, where was that enforcement? Like, why were there no security measures to ensure that all the people staying at the hotel weren't armed to the teeth? It's not like the date for this event was spontaneous. They knew this dinner was going to happen days, weeks, months in advance. It's not like it was a sudden thing, right? Look, the example I think of for where there was a failure of security practices was in the Butler, Pennsylvania. It's because it was a campaign stop, right? Like, it was super quick in terms of setting up the security perimeter and where it was being held. It was being held in like a field, and there were a bunch of like barns and buildings and stuff, and so just lots of little blind spots. This is a hotel. This is a famous hotel for where the
Yeah.
correspondence dinner was being held. This is a famous hotel with a ball, not a ballroom, with a room that can hold thousands of people. Thousands of people. And you're telling me they really can't have done more for security to make sure that the people staying in the hotel aren't armed to the teeth? Is this really something that couldn't have happened? And that's my question. What was the process wherein it was decided to not do that level of security enforcement, in the sense of why was the security only narrowed to like the magnetometers, the security at the entrance, right? Because it's a big building. There's a lot of people moving in and out of that building, of that hotel. Bad things do happen in America. The question here that I have anytime I see an event like this is, what are the lessons that are being learned from these events? Did security practices at hotels really not improve all that much after Las Vegas? Are people still really able to book a room in a hotel and bring in knives, guns, and ammo? Right? Who knows how much the amount it was that this guy had on him? But if the amount was more than the bare minimum necessary for one's own self defense, well, why were no flags raised? Why were there no alerts? Is there really such a profound failure? This goes actually back. There are two thoughts. It was one was the Las Vegas shooter and how stupidly easy it was for him to do what he did, and why it was nothing done to fix it, security practices. And the other is the 9/11 Commission report, if you ever read it, about the failure of imagination. Is this really outside the bounds of the failure of imagination for anticipating an event like this? Reagan was shot
Mm.
at that same
Yeah.
hotel in the
Oh,
80s.
same hotel.
Same
Wow.
hotel, right outside
Oh.
the doors, right? And his press secretary got put in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, right? For because of that, the Brady Foundation was formed in response to that because of gun violence. Is it really the case that in 2026, many years later, that there's just so lax security standards that they couldn't catch this guy in a net, right? Like that they couldn't figure out that he was there. This is the thing. It wasn't a sophisticated operation, right? He had knives
Mm.
and a shotgun and handguns, right? Against people with bulletproof vests and like big guns, like really big guns. Is this really where we're at as a country in terms of our security practices and law enforcement? So that's my question. What are the lessons learned here to do better, right? So that this stuff doesn't happen in like big public places and events. Because remember, these things are all interconnected. So when you're talking about things like the economy and tourism and reputation, this is not the first shooting attempt in the United States this year. This is not the first mass shooting attempt in the United States this year. Tourists, at least some of them, I'm sure, are deciding not to go to the United States, right? Because of the fact that there's so much gun violence in the United States. If you look at the statistics of gun violence in terms of mass shootings, the United States is alone in the world of the sheer number of mass shooting events that occurs. And the question every time it happens is why? Why does it keep happening here? There's just so many guns, right? Like it's super duper easy for someone to just acquire a gun. And then our security standards apparently just aren't that great to catch people with guns at public events. That's my thought. Anytime I see this, it's like, why does this keep happening? What are the tools in place to prevent things like this from happening? Are there better ways to do that? Those are the questions.
Yeah, and I think that people can reasonably conclude that unfortunately this is a more dangerous country than we would like it to be. And I can say, like, I'll take as a contrast, like, my experience. Go ahead.
Okay, let me just say one thing. The U.S. spends an exorbitant amount of money on national defense. An exorbitant amount. Trillions of dollars, like 100% more than all other countries combined. We spend so much money on outside the country. Why is there not as much resources invested in the things that would help to reduce the incidence of this stuff? Where's our universal healthcare system? Where's our tripwires to catch people with violent thoughts and tendencies before they exercise on those violent thoughts and tendencies? Like, where are those resources invested in the country proper? And anytime I see a discussion of military spending, so Trump came out and said he's got to cut Medicaid, we got to cut Medicare, we got to cut like healthcare funding, we can't provide childcare. You know what history says about desperate countries is that desperate people do desperate things, right? Some people are motivated to engage in violence because they're starving or they don't have access to medical care and they need money. They need money now. So the question always I have for these situations is, are there things at a very basic level that could be done to make life less precarious in the United States so people don't turn to desperate choices to survive?
Yeah, we need to fund mental health. The only thing to do in this case is to take care of our neighbors who are gone to a certain degree, and hopefully many of them can come back. In terms of mentally, in terms of cognizance of oneself as a member of the social body. And I'll take, in terms of America being a dangerous place, here's the contrast. I live in, I would say, a not low-crime city. We'll just put it that way. But I know where to go and where not to do, what not to do, and to be courteous and to mind my business, and I know what to do. Don't get in a confrontation when two of you are in a motor vehicle. One time I was in a parking lot and somebody wouldn't move and I said something a little sharp and the person looked at me and I was like, and I just warmed right up and I'm like, I'm sorry, please. And I smiled and they smiled and that was fine. So on one hand, you can say it's not really that bad. And that is what I was inclined to tell myself and to believe. But then I consider that there have been, like, this is the third Trump assassination attempt. And I know that assassins have lost the plot. I know I'm not reasoning here with a reasonable actor. But I'd just like to point out, if recent assassinations, JFK was shot, and then next year, LBJ wins 44 states. Reagan was shot, and then, actually, there was some time between, then he won 49 states. He survived, and he won 49 states. I would wonder if Trump hadn't been shot, whether we would have reelected a felon, and somebody who participated in January 6th, and somebody who had already lost to Joe Biden. I just wonder. And we'll never know. We'll never know. But people like an underdog, but not as much as they like a martyr or near martyr. So I just don't get it. Like the senators who killed Caesar, for example, who killed Julius Caesar, thought they were getting rid of him because he wanted to be dictator for life. He became something greater than dictator for life. We still have July, and named after his successor, we still have August. So it just strikes me as the most boneheaded thing that one could do to be an assassin of a big public official. The most idiotic thing, and I think we're very lucky since 1963 that we're on a great winning streak, and I hope and pray that it continues. And I hope that we can all just take stock and that we can let the debate continue and that the would-be violent people will sheathe their daggers and continue the debate. So forgive my emotion there, but I just had a strong sense of we're close to something not very good here, and we need to just calmly address it by talking it out. That's the way to do it, I think.
The one thing I'll say is the U.S. already has problems with political violence. The Speaker of the House of Minnesota
Yeah.
was attacked. Charlie Kirk was attacked. This is happening, and it's a problem. And the way to address this problem is that there needs to be better law enforcement, right? That one of the issues in America is that law enforcement is reactive instead of proactive. And what I mean by that is that there are signs when someone may be considering committing violence. It's just that the tools to recognize those signs are not necessarily as effective as they could be. For example, if someone sells all their possessions and buys a one-way ticket somewhere and buys a gun and a bunch of ammo, maybe an alarm bell should be raised, right? Or a red flag of some kind. And the question is, are there any kinds of tools in place to recognize those patterns or trends before an event happens, as opposed to dealing with the effects after it happens? And that's where I think there could be a lot of improvement, especially in terms of mental health and in terms of figuring out ways to deal with people in mental health crisis. So the example I'm actually thinking of is the guy down in Oregon who drove a car filled with explosives into a private athletic club, and they knew about his mental health issues for many years. And so the question is, what tools were available to try and prevent that from happening before it actually happened? And if those tools aren't as good as they could be, what are the ways to improve the ability of society to rein in the most unpredictable, the most violent, right? Because it's not like this suddenly happened. They had warning signs. If you read about the reporting on this guy had come to the attention of health authorities. They had seen that he had mental health episodes. They had seen that there was some kind of issue that he had with this particular private athletic club. And so the question becomes, what tools do exist in society for reining in violence? And that has to do with things like civil commitment laws and mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Like there's a whole list of things that could happen and maybe should happen, but they're really controversial topics in terms of discussing how they happen. And so that I think is part of the discussion that it needs a little bit more work. There's one other. It has to do actually with large ammo purchases. So why are there no red flags raised when anytime somebody makes just large purchases of ammo, right? Of if the purchase of ammo is far in excess of what one would need for something like hunting or something like why does someone need thousands of bullets, right? What is that? And so the question I have for there is, are there tools in place to flag anytime somebody buys just exorbitant amounts of ammo, right? And if there are those alerts acted upon, right? One of the things is we don't actually know. The Trump administration's bad at communicating sometimes with the public. We don't actually know if there are huge numbers of these events that are averted, that if they actually catch them and they stop it from happening way in advance. We don't know because they don't talk about it, right? It's all very hush hush. But what's very clear is that there is a problem in the United States, that people are able to acquire very powerful guns or very powerful weapons and a huge amount of ammunition and then show up and commit violence. There's a problem in the acquisition, that they're able to do it. And then there's a problem in them doing it, right? Of them being able to show up to any one location and to commit violence, right? Because that's a failure of law enforcement. Law enforcement is supposed to enforce the law, right? Brandishing is a crime. owning a weapon that's not legally permitted is a crime, right? These are all those questions that I always have. Anytime this happens, anytime an event of this nature occurs, the question is what could be done better? The system held, right? Nobody was severely hurt or injured, but what could have been done better by either private industry, right? Because these were not poor people at the Correspondents' Dinner. This is a cross section of the richest, some of the most powerful and richest people in American society were at this Correspondents' Dinner. These are not people who have no resources, right? So the question I have is, did any of them have bodyguards? Do they have private security? Do they have any? What tools do they have aside from law enforcement to protect themselves? And could those be improved? These are all the questions, right? It's always the questions. Because remember, this is like a stress test for national security reasons too. The U.S. is at war, right? Why was this guy able to walk? Look, do you remember the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan where like random acts of violence would happen? Like hotels would go kaboom and people with cars would go kaboom and their IEDs and all that other stuff and all that other fighting that would happen. Okay.
Suicide bombers,
Is it really beyond the realm of possibility that something like that could happen in the United States? What if the guy, why did it get to a point where he was even able to sprint through it, right? Like, why was there no actual literal wall, right? Like, why were the doors open? This is one of those things where I'm just very puzzled. Were there no spinning doors, no glass walls? Can you not erect a barricade? I get you let people through, right? But don't let them through so easily. Make it difficult, right? Is it just arrogance? Is it hubris? Is it pride? Is it arrogance? The U.S. thinks that it's safe and protected because it's got the big military and the big guns and the big bombs, the big ships and the big planes, right? Like,
yeah, but we don't even have enough ships.
Yeah, we don't even have enough ships. But it's like, what are these people doing? It's always a target. It was the top people of government were all there, right? It was both the president and the vice president, and some guy armed with knives and a shotgun ran through all of their security. What is that? How could he run through? Put up a wall. This is the most basic ancient technology. Put a moat with alligators in the moat. I don't care.
Yeah.
Put a moat. Put lava. Molten hot lava. Right? Put a bridge.
This is silly.
It's silly,
it's all right.
but look, it sounds silly. It seems silly.
The point is, they knew how to do it in the medieval age. They knew how to do it.
The point I'm making is,
we should know
something, anything is better than nothing.
That's
right.
That's
like,
the point.
How could he sprint on foot through this perimeter surrounded by? So the point I'm making is that we put way too much faith and trust in the people with the guns stopping the good guy with the gun, stopping the bad guy with the gun notion, and a lot less investing in just the physical infrastructure at these events to just stop some of these things from happening. So for instance, you want to stop a car from driving into people, put up really big metal, you've seen those metal barricades, right? The circular metal things where if a car drives
I've seen many a metal barricade. Yeah.
It hits the thing and it can't keep moving forward. Okay, that's not expensive. It's a chunk of metal and you put it up at the entryways and the exitways. Okay, same deal here. So how expensive really would it be for them to dig a hole, fill it with water, put a bridge, lift the bridge as the event's ongoing? What's the impediment? Really, in the grand scheme of things, how expensive would it? Is it a resistance to spending money? Is it because it was a private property that the hotel doesn't like it because it looks garish or it looks bad or it's ugly? These are all the questions I always have for any of these things. It's like, how does something so simple from looking from the outside in happen, right? That shouldn't there have been some kind of barrier, some kind of way to prevent that from happening? They could have put in place like that, right? Can you really not have a gate? This is ancient technology we're talking about. A gate with a lock, a door with a lock, right? Like a wall, a fence, some kind of impermeable barrier wherein somebody cannot run through.
Yeah. Or maybe they should have just booked the whole hotel. They should have just booked every room in the hotel and said, this hotel is closed to the public right now. We have an event. See you tomorrow. That probably would have done too.
Honestly, that would have been a very simple, very straightforward way to stop something like this. And it's cheap, right? In the grand scheme of things, in terms of the cost, it's not that expensive.
Way less expensive than if somebody goes kaboom.
Yeah. But these are always the questions I have anytime these things happen is were there steps that could have been taken to better prevent it from happening that cost very little but could have been as effective or more effective than just reacting in the moment?
Yeah.
Is where was the planning ahead of time? And that I think is a question worth discussing because it has to do with the failures of American society to anticipate the future and plan accordingly. Time and time again, it keeps happening. And it's like, what
Yeah.
are steps that can be taken proactively to try and reduce the incidence of violence before it happens? Because when it's happening, that sucks. It sucks that it happens, the consequences suck, it leads to trauma for life, people die, people get hurt, that it all sucks. It's terrible. But there's got to be ways to fortify society so we're not living in constant danger and fear. There's got to be.
Yeah.
These technologies exist.
I think that because time was, and I think if you put this in these terms, it might be more palatable to the other side here. Time was, I don't know if it was the 60s or the 70s, you had hunting clubs at high schools, and students, brought their rifle and gave their rifle to their homeroom teachers. Time was. But these are not those times. Anyone would agree that you can't just have the immature carrying a gun around because they're not there. They're not there. I'm pointing at my head. They're not there. Likewise, I think it could be reasonably established that while we have a mental health crisis going on in this country, the free flow of guns and ammo, it's like an emergency. We got a mental health emergency, and if you combine a mental health emergency with a firearms emergency, you could have the worst situation that we've ever seen in terms of the domestic situation here in this country. That's what I'm thinking with all of this, just because of how many close calls we have. And by the way, in terms of how we've been on the right side of luck, I meant in terms of presidents, because the assassination of Kennedy changed the trajectory of the 60s, which changed the trajectory of everything. Everything.
I understood what you were saying. What I'm saying is that when you're talking about safety, public safety, it's not just the leaders that get affected by the choices that are made by society in terms of safety. It is much more difficult to get a license to drive a car.
Yeah.
It takes a lot more time. There's a lot more barriers and licensure and requirements to drive a car than it is for somebody to go out and buy a gun. Period. There's a lot more barriers in place between the steps that need to be taken for somebody to get a car, own a car, rent a car, drive a car, than there are for somebody to go out, find a gun, buy ammo. There just are way more steps. And so the question I have is, can there be more effort made to screen people before they get guns, right? That it's called universal background checks is the first step, but it is a step, is you make sure that criminals don't get guns. It's a question of priorities and values and all these discussions that happen of the level of seriousness with which they approach the discussion matters. And it's very obvious that there's a reticence on the part of, in particular, the Republican Party to have any kind of meaningful gun control, any kind of meaningful protections put in place in terms of background checks, because it cuts into the bottom line, right? This goes back to the NRA and how effective it is at political lobbying. It cuts into the profit margins of these companies, and these companies make exorbitant amounts of money. The question always, for all these situations, always comes down to money. It's, do we make a profit off the suffering of people in healthcare, or do we figure out a way to actually get people access to healthcare? Do we cut into the profit margins of planes, for instance, of air travel, or do we come up with a way, a low-cost option, even if it operates at a loss, for people to have affordable air travel? Because right now, some segment of the population cannot afford to travel by air, period. They cannot do it. There is not enough money in their hands to get on a plane and go somewhere else, which means they're limited to walking, bikes, cars, trains, buses, right? Some segment of U.S. society now has a lower quality of life because of the war in Iran and the rise in fuel prices. But also, So talking about actually air travel, why don't we have meaningful alternatives to jet fuel? Can we have electric planes? Can we have renewable funded planes? What's going on there? Those are all the questions I have for something like that. Anyway, sorry for going on my little tangent.
No, it's an important. That's why they call it Mondays with Mike.
Yeah.
No, but it's an important topic to reckon with because it's our country today. But how about this, really quick? How about a walk across America for mental health or for better transit? How about walk across America?
It just
What do you
sounds very dangerous. There's a horizon pedestrian deaths from getting hit by cars.
But you got to do it so that you can do it. You got to do it so that you can make way to do it.
No, I understand. That's a level of courage that I applaud anybody who takes on the task of walking Forrest Gump style across the entire country.
Yeah, but not running. That would be too hard. That's just too much.
I can acknowledge it takes a lot of effort. It's very, courageous to do it.
Yeah.
Hey, what about Norah O'Donnell, though? What about Norah O'Donnell, within a day of the incident at the Hilton, Norah brought Trump on 60 Minutes and asked him about the experience and asked him a bunch of questions. But among the questions involved reading from the shooter's manifesto, which included a discussion of pedophilia and as it pertains to the Epstein files and the leadership of the country. Typically a lot of media outlets won't release the shooter's name or picture or ideas for the sake of not encouraging violence to get yourself on TV. But is that applicable in this particular situation? What do you think?
Okay, so reporters are in a unique place in American society because they have access, right? They get to speak truth directly to power in a way that most American citizens don't. And they get to elicit a reaction in the moment on tape, on film, of what the reaction is to the questions asked. So the question, I think, was perfectly appropriate of asking what the president thought of the manifesto in the moment, immediately after it happened, because that's what reporters do. They ask questions and they get answers. I think it was perfectly appropriate to ask that question to get a sense of what the reaction would be. But there's another reason, and it's very important, is that in order to understand why something happened, you have to actually discuss what the motivations of the people doing the things are, right? If they publicly express some kind of sentiment or emotion or argument, then part of the discussion in a democracy is to roundly disagree with those sentiments or to present arguments against what the motivations or the statements of whoever's committing the violence are, right? That there has to be an affirmative disagreement with the action taken, why. And that is the role that reporters play in society because the American public isn't allowed really to have all that much access directly with the leadership of the country. So other countries do actually have something that's a little bit more open. So the UK has the questions of the prime minister done by the legislature, where the elected representatives of the government literally just ask questions of the prime minister and he answers, right? That doesn't happen in the United States. Our sole interaction of the back and forth that generally happens in the United States between the president and the public happens in all three places. Interviews one-on-one with reporters, the press conferences that happen with the press secretary, and then social media, but not really, right? There's no actual reaction in the moment. And here's why it's so important now and why I actually applaud Norah O'Donnell for doing what she did and asking the question the way that she did is this is a midterm election year. And the first midterm election of every presidential term is where the American people are asked a very simple question. Do they want to give the president more power or do they want to check that power? Do they want to limit the exercise of that power? That's the only question that's being asked in this election, really, of choosing which side to vote for. If you vote for the Democrats, the opposition party, that means that you're reducing the effects of the president overall during the term. If you vote for more of the same to keep the Republicans in power, so currently the Republicans hold the House, they hold the Senate, they have a majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court, and they have the presidency. It's full clean sweep, right? They've got it all. If you want more of representatives essentially allowing the president to run roughshod over whatever he wants to do with his power, and they won't use the tools they have at their disposal to try and check his worst impulses, then you vote for the Republicans and keep getting more of the same. But reporters play a very important role in showing that contrast. That's why it was important for Norah O'Donnell to ask the question that she did when she did it, because his reaction was very telling, at least from what I saw and heard. His reaction was because she didn't say him, right? Trump said it was him.
Yeah.
That's the big thing, is that Norah O'Donnell just read the words, and then Trump's reaction was that he assumed it was him in those words. That was very telling, revealing. That was very informative for the voter to understand where his mind is as the leader of the country in terms of this discussion, this topic, right? And it's very important because there was a law passed that said that all the files needed to be released. They needed to be unredacted. There needed to be justifications for those redactions. I'm not sure you noticed, but the Attorney General of the United States just got fired. Half of those files haven't been released. Of the files that have been released, a considerable number of them are still completely redacted. There were pages of those files that were just all black ink. They were just covered over. There was no data, no information. I'm not sure you've noticed, other countries, they've prosecuted people. They've put people in jail for some of the stuff that came out in those files.
Wait a sec. Are you telling me that Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, is out?
Yeah. Did you not know that she got fired?
I guess the Dow is below 50,000, so I guess it makes sense.
You're making a joke. But the point is that these files haven't been resolved. There is still an ongoing debate and an ongoing investigation from Congress into what's in these files and the implications of who in government is actually implicated in these files in terms of knowing him, interacting with him, or engaging with him in any way. And there's a huge cover up, no question, right? A huge number of the files were redacted. Half weren't released. The law was pretty clear that all the files needed to be released and the redactions needed to be explained. They weren't. So anyways, the point is that this is an election year. This is a very important election because it's going to determine the next 2 years in terms of whether we have some kind of check on what's going on. And Norah O'Donnell did her job. That's her job. Ask questions. I thought it was appropriate.
Yeah, I think that it reflects that we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, there is no obligation to defer or to demur, and certainly not to grovel. There is no obligation therein. So,
look,
whereas, go ahead.
Part of the function of government is that it provides a forum for people to have a redress of their grievances. And time and again, we've seen with this administration that, in particular in the immigration space, they have not hired enough lawyers. They have not hired enough immigration judges. There's a huge backlog, millions of cases, and people are sitting in detention centers waiting to have their day in court to be heard because the government won't let them exist in society and won't let them leave. If you read articles about what's going on with the deportation issues, some people want to voluntarily leave, and just the sheer amount of cases means that they're not even being allowed to leave in a timely manner. They have to sit around in pretty much jail cells waiting just to leave when they're willingly saying they will go. Just put them on a plane and let them leave. And they're not even letting them do that. And so it's incredibly bizarre that for a government that says they want to deport people and want to get them out, that it's taking so long, right? That it shouldn't be. It should be very fast, right? It should be if somebody says that's caught up, that's undocumented or here illegally, and they say to the government, I'll go, right? I'll leave today. You know what the government should do? Put them on a plane and send them away, right? Bye. Here's the door. Not wait 100 days. not wait 6 months. So what's going on there? And that's the question that I always have anytime this happens. Is there something else going on? Is somebody making money from people being in these detention centers? Who's making money? Are they friends of the administration? What's going on, right? Is there some element of the political that is making money hand over fist from just having people sitting in these detention centers wasting away? Because what on earth is going on? Anyways, sorry again.
Right.
We need we need journalists to be on it in order to ask such questions. Yeah. Oh. So we agree that Norah O'Donnell asked the right question, and usually you might not want to give highlight to Shooter's Manifesto, but in this case, he's not the only one in the country asking such questions, and I think that the way that she asked the question, essentially there wasn't going to be, given how fast the news cycle runs, there wasn't going to be a better time for it. And I hope that the media continues to be undeferential in this and future administrations. You want to have the last word on this?
So just talking about questions our reporters asked, there was a reporter that asked, why is Trump focusing on these projects during the Iran war, the reflecting pool and the ballroom and all that stuff? And he just started yelling at her, started saying just mean things to her, like she doesn't see dirt and all this other stuff. The point is, reporters serve a role in showing what the priorities of the government are and speaking truth to power, getting power to talk back, essentially, to let us know what's on their mind, because that gives people the information they need and equips them with the tools they need to decide how to vote in the election, right? Do we want more of this? Do we want less of this? Do we want more oversight? Do we want less oversight? These are the questions. This is the opportunity. This is the moment.
Mondays with Mike.